Imagine growing up in a house where fear wasn't just an emotion, it was a way of life. A place where your mother whispered warnings of damnation, and the outside world was painted as a pit of sin. Now imagine that twisted environment shaping the mind of someone who would go on to commit some of the most brutal and horrifying acts imaginable. This is the story of Ed Gein. Not the monster he became, not yet, but the boy he was. A boy whose life was doomed from the very beginning. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906 in La Crosse, Wisconsin. At first glance, his early life might seem like any other small-town story from the early 20th century. But scratch the surface, and you'll find a family dynamic that was, well, let's just say less than ordinary. Ed was the youngest of two boys born to Augusta and George Gein, and if we're being honest, calling George a father is generous. He was an alcoholic who couldn't hold down a job and was known for his explosive temper. He was more of a shadow in the house than a supportive parent. But Augusta, oh, she was a force to be reckoned with. Let's talk a bit more about Augusta. She was a deeply religious woman. And by deeply religious, I mean she took her fire and brimstone sermons and turned them into a daily performance for her children. To Augusta, the world outside was a cesspool of sin, and she was determined to protect her boys from its influence. Born in the late 1800s, Augusta was one of 8 children born to immigrants from Prussia. Her family left their homeland as part of the old Lutheran exodus to escape the reforms occurring in their church. The teachings of the old Lutherans were very strict, emphasizing the sinful nature of humanity. This formed the deeply religious belief within Augusta that every person's thoughts and actions were tainted by sin and deserved eternal damnation. Influenced by her upbringing, Augusta ran the household with an iron fist. Every day, she drilled into Ed and his older brother Henry that women, all women except for herself, were vile, wicked creatures designed to lead men astray. Imagine growing up hearing that every single day. Of the two boys, Augusta favoured Ed. She saw him as much more obedient than his brother, which made him all the more susceptible to her manipulation. It's no wonder Ed grew up with complicated feelings about women. And Augusta didn't stop at moral lessons. She isolated her family on a desolate farm in Plainfield, Wisconsin, far away from the prying eyes of the world. No friends, no outside influences, just her, George, and her 2 boys. This is the kind of isolation that could really do something to a person. The farm was a lonely, eerie place. Over 150 acres of barren land, with only the family home sitting in the middle of it. For Ed, this isolation was his entire world. He didn't know what life outside the farm was like, and Augusta made sure it stayed that way. But even within the walls of that farmhouse, Ed's life wasn't exactly cosy. Augusta controlled every aspect of their lives, from what they read, to what they ate, to what they believed. And when George was around, his drunken rages added another layer of fear to the mix. It was a pressure cooker, and Ed was stuck in the middle of it. While at the farmhouse, Augusta stunted Ed's emotional and social development by preventing him from forming any relationships outside the family, particularly with women. She instilled a deep sense of shame and confusion about natural human desires and normal relationships. This isolation made it difficult for Ed to distinguish reality from the distorted views Augusta imposed on him. On top of this, during Ed's only time allowed away from the family farm at grade school, he was awkward and socially withdrawn, constantly bullied for his congenital, lazy eye and the growth on his tongue that affected his speech. Each afternoon when Ed and his brother returned from school, Augusta would remind them about the evils of alcohol and women, reading Bible passages to support these lectures. And if that weren't bad enough, anytime young Ed actually tried to make friends at school, Augusta would excoriate him and tell him the person came from a bad or evil family and ask him if he wanted to become a loser like his father. She also told him that to remain loyal to her, he should remain a virgin, because engaging in those types of activities with women was sinful and would lead to eternal damnation. Fresh on the heels of one of her speeches about the evils of the outside world, Ed uncharacteristically disobeyed his mother's rule and sneaked into the slaughter shed where he found both his mother Augusta and Father George with a pig carcass hanging upside down for processing. The moment Augusta sliced the pig down the centre to release its intestines, Ed reportedly experienced a feeling of being turned on, which indicates just how confused and disturbed he was becoming as he developed within the dominant worldview of his overbearing mother. In 1940, Ed's father, George Gein, passed away. You might think that his death would have brought some relief to the family. After all, he was a violent drunk who contributed little to their lives, but for Ed, it was the beginning of a new kind of dependence on Augusta. Now it was just Augusta, Henry, and Ed. The dynamic shifted, but the dominance of Augusta remained unshaken. Her clear favoritism of Ed caused tension between the brothers. Ed, who had always been the more obedient and impressionable son, clung to his mother more tightly than ever, while his brother Henry, on the other hand, started to pull away. Henry was the first to question the iron grip of Augusta. He began speaking out against the strict and absurd worldview she was preaching to the boys, even hinting to Ed that their mother might not be the saint she claimed to be. But questioning Augusta, that was a dangerous game. In 1944, tragedy again struck the household. Ed's brother Henry died in what was officially labelled a, quote, brush fire accident on the family farm. But here's where things get suspicious. When the authorities arrived, they found Henry's body in a spot untouched by the fire, with suspicious bruising on his head. Did Ed have something to do with it? We'll never know for sure. But after Henry's death, it was just Ed and Augusta. The next year in 1945, Augusta suffered a series of strokes. For Ed, her declining health was devastating. He devoted himself entirely to her care, but her eventual death in December of that year shattered him. She was his world, his moral compass, his everything. And now an enormous and critical part of his life was gone. Forever. With his mother gone, Ed was left alone on the farm, drowning in grief and isolation. And it was in that isolation that his mind began to unravel. Without Augusta's domineering and controlling presence, the darker corners of his psyche started to take over, eventually leading to the horrible and unimaginable actions that he would unleash onto the world. During his adult life, Ed seemed to live quietly within his community for several years, known by most as a simple, quiet, but slightly weird man. But eventually his terrible deeds were uncovered. When the authorities did finally arrest Ed and conducted a search of his farmhouse, they uncovered a horrific scene that defied comprehension. What they found revealed not only evidence to the cruelty and torture he imposed upon his victims, but also artifacts that suggested a deep and unsettling obsession with human anatomy. These horrifying objects, like lampshades, gloves, clothing, and more, were crafted with unsettling precision and made from human remains that Ed had acquired through grave robbing over the years. He later admitted to making nighttime visits to local cemeteries, where he dug up recently buried individuals to be used for his morbid crafting sessions. These acts of depravity and wickedness later inspired some of the most infamous characters in horror movies and pop culture, such as Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Norman Bates in Psycho, and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. Looking back, Ed Gein's early life was a perfect storm of isolation, abuse, and psychological manipulation. Obviously, a terrible childhood does not excuse the horrors he went on to commit, but it helps us understand how a man like this can come to exist. In the end, he was as much a product of his environment as he was of his own dark impulses. A chilling reminder of how deeply our upbringing can shape who we become. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this story of Ed Gein's early life as unsettling as I did, and enjoy learning about the influences that created some of the world's most evil people, be sure to like and subscribe. I also love hearing your thoughts and ideas, so let me know what you think in the comments. And remember, behind every monster lies a story. Until next time.